A common object type used in a 3D scene is a mesh. Blender comes with a number of primitive mesh shapes. When you start Blender, by default, you get this cube, which is a primitive mesh. Adding primitives to the scene can be done in a couple ways. First, let's delete the default cube by selecting it and use the delete key. You can also use the X key. There are two ways to add a primitive to the scene. The first way is to go to the Add menu, and under the Mesh menu, you can add a primitive. The hotkey to access this same menu is Shift-A. And make sure your cursor is in the viewport to access this menu. There are 10 standard primitive shapes in Blender: plane, cube, circle, UV sphere, icosphere, cylinder, cone, torus, grid, and monkey, who's called Suzanne. In this case, we're just going to add in a cube. If you look at the bottom left of the viewport, you notice that you have a popover that gives you various options for each mesh. We'll be looking at the popover menu shortly. The easiest way to start modeling Blender is to simply start with a primitive mesh and then reshape it, add detail, and turn it into the model you want. This is called box modeling. In order to edit any object, including primitives, we need to go into edit mode. Let's begin by selecting the cube and deleting it. Now let's add a UV sphere using the shortcut Shift-A. By default, we are in object mode, where we can select the actual objects in the scene. If we want to edit the sphere, we need to left-click the sphere to select it if it isn't already selected, and then hit the Tab key to go into edit mode. You can choose to work with a vertex, edge, or face. You can access each of these modes in the top left of the viewport. The hotkeys are 1 for vertex mode, 2 for edge mode, and 3 for face mode. There are multiple ways you can select vertices, edges, and faces. The most obvious is just by left-clicking on a vertex, edge, or face to select one of these options. Holding Shift will allow you to select multiple vertices, edges, or faces. You can select the entire mesh by hovering the cursor over the mesh and using the L key. You can also use the box or border tool via the shortcut of B and your left mouse button. However, this will only select what is in view. You can also use the circle tool via the shortcut of C and left mouse button. You can use the middle mouse button to enlarge or shrink the circle. After you've made the selection, use the right mouse button to finalize the selection. Another way to choose multiple vertices is using the lasso tool via the shortcut of Control and right mouse button. There's a potential problem with using these tools to make selections. If you tumble around the back of the sphere, you'll notice that you haven't selected the back-facing parts of the mesh. One way around this problem is to use wireframe mode. Using the Z key, you can bring up the pie menu and select wireframe. Now you can select the front and back vertices, edges, or faces. Another way around this problem is using the X-ray mode, which is available at the top right of the viewport. To select a loop of vertices, make sure you're in vertex mode, hold down the Alt key, and left-click in the center of a vertex. You can select multiple rows of vertices by using Shift, Alt, left-click. Depending on which side of the vertex your cursor is, you can select the horizontal or vertical vertex loops. The same type of selection can be done with edges and faces as well. To select an edge loop, make sure you're in edge mode, hold down the Alt key, and left-click in the center of an edge. You can select multiple rows of edges by using Shift, Alt, left-click. Depending on whether you're clicking on a horizontal or vertical edge, we can select the horizontal or vertical edge loops. To select the face loop, make sure you're in face mode, hold down the Alt key, and left-click in the center of an edge. You can select multiple rows of faces by using Shift, Alt, left-click. Depending on whether you're clicking on a horizontal or vertical intersection of faces, you can select the horizontal or vertical face loops. Two other hotkeys that are useful for modeling are the More and Less options. If you select a vertex, edge, or face, you can easily select more or less based around your selection. If we select a face on the sphere and hit Ctrl numpad plus, we will expand the selection. If we hit Ctrl numpad minus, we'll shrink the selection. One thing to note is that when you add objects in edit mode, they'll be considered one object. If you need separate objects, you have two options. One, you can add new objects in object mode. This will mean you have separate objects automatically. Second, in edit mode, we can use the P key to separate the selected object. Proportional editing allows us to edit vertices, edges, and faces with a fall off. If we choose one vertex from the top of the sphere and begin moving it by using the G key to grab and the Z key to lock the movement to the Z axis, you'll notice that I get a sharp edge without any sort of fall off. This is really an inefficient way of modeling, which is where proportional editing comes in. We can turn proportional editing on or off either by clicking on the icon at the top center of the viewport or clicking the O key. Let's choose the topmost vertex and begin to move it. We can see how you now have a gradual fall off rather than a sharp edge. We can also change the amount of area that we're affecting by scrolling the middle mouse button. Once we have the circle the size we want, we just need to move the cursor. As we move the cursor, we can continue to resize the area. Once we finish the modification, we just need to left-click to lock in the modification. Let's turn off proportional editing for now. An easy option for moving objects precisely in Blender is to use Snap. Let's tab back in object mode and delete the UV sphere, then add a cube to the scene. The easiest way to snap objects is to snap to the grid. Select the magnet icon at the top center of the viewport, or use Shift-Tab to turn on and off snapping. When I use the G key to grab the cube and the X key to lock the movement to the X-axis, the cube will snap to the grid. We can also snap faces, edges, and vertices. Tab into Edit mode and choose Face Select mode and make sure Snap is activated. Select the cube and use Shift-D to duplicate the cube. Enter will complete the operation. Move this duplicated cube along the X-axis. Select the face that is facing the original cube and choose Face Nearest from the Snap menu. Using the G key, we'll snap the faces together. Use Ctrl Z to undo this procedure. Go into Edge Select mode, which is 2, and make sure Snap is activated. Left-click on the top edge to choose it, and then using the G key, notice the edges snap together. Undo the snapping procedure with Ctrl-Z. Go into Vertex Select mode and make sure Snap is activated. Left-click on the top front vertex to choose it, and then using the G key, notice the edges snap together. Undo that snapping procedure with Ctrl-Z. Then use Shift-Tab to turn off snapping. The outliner is located in the top right of the areas. This is where you can inspect the contents of your file. All of your data from the blend file will be located here. You can select, rename, delete, and parent the objects in the outliner. Scene collections contain all of the scene's objects. You can make your own collections in a couple different ways. First, you can right-click on Scene Collection and choose New Collection. You can then double-click on the new collection and rename it. Second, in Object Mode, you can select one or more objects in your scene and use the M key to access the Move to Collection menu. Here you can add a new collection, and the objects you have selected will be moved to that collection. If you have an object that you want to move from one collection to another, you can simply select the object in the outliner and drag and drop it into another collection. You can also select the objects in the viewport and use the M key to access the Move to Collection menu, where you can choose which collection you want to move the objects to. The default unit of measurement in Blender is metric. In the Scene tab, you'll find the Units section. You can use the default units or change to the imperial measurement. If you use the metric system, you can change the length to meters, centimeters, etc. And that is what Blender will use throughout the scene. If you're using the imperial system, you can change the length to feet or inches, and that is what Blender will use throughout the scene. In edit mode, you can also turn on the edge length properties overlay in the overlay menu. If I select vertices, an edge, or a face, I'll see the measurements. 2 meters or 6.56 feet is the default scale of the primitive mesh objects. You also have the option for edge angle, face area, and face angle. I will go over just a few tools in this course. You can use the link in the description to access the Blender manual to learn about the other tools. In edit mode, the tools are located on the left side of the viewport in the toolbar. If you simply hold down your left mouse button, you can access the subtools of the Select Box tool, which includes the Box Select tool, Circle Select tool, and Lasso Select tool. The 3D Cursor tool allows you to left-click anywhere in the scene and move the cursor. Shift-S will allow you to move the cursor back to the world origin. The Move tool allows you to use the manipulator and move the object along any of the 3 axes. The 3 plane-like parts of the manipulator allows you to move in 2 of the 3 directions at the same time. The Rotate tool allows you to smoothly rotate the object around each axis. The Scale tool allows you to use the manipulator and scale the object along any of the 3 axes. The three plane-like parts of the manipulator allows you to scale in two of the three directions at the same time. The transform tool is now a combination of the move, rotate, and scale tools. The extrude region tool allows you to select a vertex, edge, or face and drag to extrude a region of the mesh. There are also sub-tools available. The insert tool allows you to select a face, hold down the left mouse button, and drag in order to inset the face. This can also be used on multiple faces. The bevel tool allows you to select an edge, hold down the left mouse button, and drag to add a bevel. If you keep your mouse button held down, you can use the middle mouse button to add loop cuts. The loop cut tool adds a loop cut to the mesh, which you can immediately slide to a new location by keeping the left mouse button held down. In order to add more than one loop cut, you can simply go to the header and change the number of cuts field. The knife tool will allow you to divide a face into multiple faces. The bisect tool will allow you to cut a mesh into two pieces along a custom plane. Popovers contain settings and tool properties. For example, if you add a UV sphere, you'll notice a popover in the lower left corner of the viewport. You will have the option of changing the properties of the UV sphere, such as segments, rings, etc. It is important to note that as soon as you adjust, such as move, rotate, or scale, or click away from the object, the popover will disappear. Modifiers are automatic operations that affect an object's geometry in a non-destructive way. You can perform many effects automatically that will otherwise be too tedious to do manually and without affecting the base geometry of your object. I'll briefly show you a couple commonly used modifiers. The array modifier creates an array of copies of the base object, with each copy being offset from the previous one. If I select the UV sphere and add a simple array modifier, I can quickly make copies of the original UV sphere. I can quickly and easily increase the number of UV spheres and change the spacing. If I make changes to the original UV sphere, the changes will affect all of the copies. Once I'm done, I can use Ctrl-A to apply the modifier, or use the drop-down menu to apply the modifier. Now note, once you've applied the modifier, you can't make any further changes, so I would advise not applying the modifier until you're sure you won't need it again. The bevel modifier bevels the edges of the mesh it is applied to. If I add a cube and then add a bevel modifier, I have access to a non-destructive way of adding bevels to the edges without doing it destructively in edit mode. I can change the amount of the bevel as well as the number of segments. More segments means a smoother bevel, but also more geometry. The Boolean modifier performs operations on meshes that are otherwise too complex to achieve with as few steps by adding meshes manually. You'll need 2 meshes to use the Boolean modifier. I select the first cube and add a Boolean modifier, and select the UV sphere as the object. The difference operation will subtract the UV sphere from the cube. Once I apply the modifier and hide the UV sphere, which can be done using the H key, you can see a cutout of the cube. If I add a Boolean modifier to the second cube with the UV sphere as the object, I can change the operation to union. This type of operation will join the meshes together into one mesh. If I add a Boolean modifier to the third cube with the UV sphere as the object, I can change the operation to intersect. This type of operation will keep only the overlapping areas of both meshes. The subdivision surface modifier is used to split the faces of a mesh into smaller faces, giving it a smoother appearance. If I add a new UV sphere and turn on the statistics under the overlays menu, you can see that the UV sphere currently has 128 faces. If I add a subdivision surface modifier and change the levels to 2, I can now see that I have a much smoother and denser mesh with 1920 faces. If you want to be able to work on multiple meshes at once, all you need to do is select all the meshes and then tab into Edit mode. This is called multi-object editing. If I add an icosphere and a cylinder, I can select both of them and tab into Edit mode. I can then modify both of the objects. When I tab back into object mode, both objects have been modified, but they remain separate objects. Thanks for watching. If you would like to help support the channel, please visit my Ko-fi page where you can purchase a digital product from the shop or become a member. I also offer a one-on-one mentorship. If you enjoyed this video on the modeling tools in Blender, then you're probably interested in 3D modeling or game development. So if you're interested in these topics, you may enjoy this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a good day.